right, good morning. Welcome everyone. And thank you so much for joining us for the housing panel hosted by the United Way's Emerging Leaders Society and Cynergy, a division of the Kennebec Valley Chamber of Commerce. My name is Caitlin Pushard and I am the Director of Development at the Children's Center. And I'm lucky enough to be a part of both of these incredible groups. For those of you who don't know, the United Way of Kennebec Valley created the Emerging Leaders Society for supporters who wanted to contribute both time and money and make connections with others with similar interests. And the Kennebec Valley Chamber of Commerce established Cynergy over a decade ago for young professionals interested in networking and developing professionally with a smaller component focused on giving back. With so many similarities and common audiences, the group has come together to offer these quarterly presentations in 2021. While similar in many ways, Emerging Leaders really focuses more on volunteerism and generating opportunities to support the community, and Cynergy concentrates more on the programming and networking piece of the programming. So if anyone would like any more information about ELS, you can contact Michelle Tibbetts. We'll be sure to include her email in the chat box. And if you're interested in Cynergy, you can reach out to Iris at the KV Chamber. And likewise, we will include her information in the chat box. So today, we're here for a housing panel discussing the housing crisis in the Kennebec Valley. The panel will look at the impact the pandemic has had on housing, as well as supply and demand leading to homelessness in the area. Just as far as housekeeping, I will be posing a series of questions for the panelists, but encourage those watching to type questions into the chat. We'll try to get to them as they come up, but we'll also offer an opportunity at the end for questions. Another just reminder, please remember to use speaker view and to keep your mic muted during the presentation, unless, well, I guess the questions will be typed into the chat. So if you could just remain muted, that would be great. So we'll start by having the panelists introduce themselves and just say a little bit about yourself. We can start with Mike.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Shaughnessy. I'm the program manager for homeless initiatives at Maine Housing, or the Maine State Housing Authority. I'm going to give one quick warning. I just moved yesterday, so if you hear strange noises, it's the movers in the other room. So I work for Maine Housing. I work in the Homeless Initiatives Department. We support shelters throughout, homeless shelters and homeless services throughout the state. Maine Housing also is a public housing authority. We have subsidy programs. We also do home ownership programs. We're a finance agency that finances mortgages for low and middle income Mainers. Happy to be here.
Great, thank you, Mike. We'll move on to Michelle.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michelle Prince. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Community Services at Kennebec Valley Community Action Program. Most of you probably know us as KV-CAP. We're a multi-purpose agency with a heavy focus on working with low-income folks and helping folks work towards self-sufficiency. We operate a number of programs, including Head Start, child care, transportation, both to medical appointments, and we also operate the public transit systems in Augusta, Waterville, and Skowhegan areas. And then we also do social services. We have a home visiting program for new parents called Maine Families. We oversee the Child Abuse and Neglect Councils in Somerset and Kennebec County. And then we also have a very large energy and housing community initiatives program, which is where a lot of the issues that we'll be talking about today surface for us. We do LIHEAP, which is providing subsidies for energy. We do weatherization, home repair, and we also are operating the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which we'll be talking about a little bit more later. And a few other things, but I could go on and on. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Sarah?
Good morning, everybody. So my name is Sarah. I'm the Administrative Director of Bridging the Gap. We are a nonprofit program based in Augusta, and we essentially work on the front lines with individuals who are experiencing some form of poverty, whether that's generational poverty or unexpected poverty. And we kind of balance addressing short-term needs. We have a clothing bank and a hygiene pantry, and we run the warming center. And then we also are really leaning into shifting focus or expanding focus on long-term solutions. And so we do have a pretty hefty resource connection department, and we also run a volunteer program that is for individuals who are looking to build skills, learn new things, build confidence, and also volunteer to help run our programs. So I'm happy to be here.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And Amanda?
Hi there, I'm Amanda Olson. I'm the Executive Director at Augusta Housing Authority. We are a public housing authority serving Augusta and all towns within a 10-mile radius of Augusta. So our jurisdiction aligns fairly closely with that of the United Way of Kennebec Valley, I would say. We administer several programs related to housing, and we also develop new affordable housing. People primarily know us for our work in administering the Section 8 voucher program. We typically serve between 500 and 600 families a year through that subsidy program, which allows folks to utilize federal subsidy in private market rentals throughout our community. We also have an aging in place program where we go into homes that are owned by either seniors or those that might have physical disabilities, and make low cost, high impact improvements to those homes so that folks are able to stay in place in their homes rather than moving to a different type of living situation. We have a number of other smaller programs as well, but those are kind of the highlights. So I'm happy to be here today. It's always exciting to talk about housing, and I think particularly now it's come to a place where I think everyone's recognizing how critically important it is for us to put housing into the light. So thank you all for being here.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. So I think we're going to jump right into questions. And the first several are kind of general questions that I'll be posing to the group, and then we have some more specific ones. Mike, how about we start off with you, if you don't mind? Can you tell us a little bit how the housing world and local people in need of housing have been impacted by the pandemic?
Well, they've been impacted very significantly. So what we've seen in the Homeless Initiatives Department, Maine Housing, is when we're talking about the bottom rung, people who do not have housing, is that they are staying in homelessness longer. They're finding it hard to find housing. We're running into the issue where we're not having a shortage of vouchers or subsidies to put out, which is usually a problem. But we have vouchers. Everybody who's looking for housing right now has vouchers in hand. They cannot find units. And we have anecdotally heard that part of that is the eviction moratorium. While the eviction moratorium is doing good things for people, the people who are trying to get into housing from homelessness rely on a bit of churn from evictions and from that type of thing to free up units to then lease up with a subsidy. And with the eviction moratorium, that has stopped. So what's happening in the shelter system and in the homeless response system is that we have a certain flow where people come in, people come out, and people haven't been leaving. So it's a backed up flow right now, and it's a significant issue. It's also been an issue with people in housing because some of this housing is not necessarily safe for, infection control. The ventilation is not good. The systems within the buildings are not good. So it's causing a greater hazard for people who are in housing. And it's causing people who may be sharing housing to say, you no longer can stay here. I'm staying with my aunt, I'm staying with my uncle. they say you can no longer stay here, you need to leave because it's not safe. And that puts more people on the street and is putting greater pressure on the housing stock as a whole.
Great, thanks, Mike. Sarah, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Sure. I mean, I think Mike covered a lot of what I would have said as well. Again, we're sort of on the front line, so we definitely see that, have seen it in action. And I think I want to also just say, like, up front too, is that probably during this panel, you're going to hear things that might sound contradictory, right? And I think that that is indicative of how complex this whole subject is. And a word that's like really helped me a lot lately and in my life is the word "and." And so, you know, it's supporting those who are experiencing poverty and homelessness, and also supporting landlords and building owners. It's a really complex issue. So I just want to put that out there to everyone who's joined us today. So we, one of the biggest things, of course, we saw right when the pandemic started was those who were homeless needing emergency shelter. And that became difficult for a number of reasons. One, the capacity of the shelters, of course, had to change and shift due to the pandemic. There was also, people had to wait for a negative COVID test. And so what ended up happening is that a lot of folks were put up in hotels while either waiting for a bed, or that was just where they stayed throughout their homelessness. I think that was the biggest thing that we've seen. And you know, now that some of the support that has been in place is going to be decreasing, we are prepared to see some more of that this year. So.
Sorry, thank you. We did have a question that popped up in the chat box that I think would go to you, Mike. Let me see here. Do the funds from the ERA go to the tenant or to the landlord?
So generally by default, ERA funding that's emergency rental assistance. ERA funds generally by default go to the landlord. I believe there are situations, I don't deal directly with the ERA program, but obviously I am peripherally involved at a great degree. So I believe there are circumstances where payment can go to the tenant if it were something like a shared living situation. I would have to look into the details, or maybe Michelle can back, because she's operating the ERA program in the Kennebec Valley, so she can expand on that.
Right. So there are instances where the money can go to the tenant if, for example, we're not getting the paperwork back that's needed from the landlord, or what have you. Then there have been instances when that money can go to the tenant, and then they can pay the landlord.
Great, thank you. Michelle, I'll have this next question go to you. What actions have been taken to alleviate housing needs since the start of the pandemic?
Well, so obviously, probably one of the biggest has been the ERA funding. In many ways, there have been many more opportunities for people who are unstably housed and are having challenges paying for rent, be able to pay for that rent than ever because of the funds that have come in due to the pandemic. But because of some of the things that Mike and Sarah both have said, there are challenges that have come up with that as well. If people are in, you know, an unsafe housing situation or an undesirable housing situation, they're unable to easily find a new place to live. The homeless situation, I'd just like to kind of circle back to that if I can for a minute. We have seen an explosion of calls at KVCAP over probably the last 3 weeks that we had not experienced prior, of people who are currently homeless. And we're trying to figure out why that is. We think it's a variety of things. One, because the new iteration of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program can provide funds to help people who are in a temporary housing situation get into a permanent housing situation. So that's new, because prior those ERA funds could not be used for that. So we think that's part of it. We also know that the shelters are getting full. I mean, the shelters themselves are full. The hotels where they've been putting people up are full. And we also are, as we're trying to work with people and help them find a place to stay, even if it is a hotel, it's even getting difficult to find hotels that will take people who are homeless right now. And then one other thing that I would like to mention in terms of the housing challenge is, not only is there not a lot of housing available, but many of the units, the price has gone up dramatically in the last year and a half. So a lot of units are being priced right out of the reach of not only the people that, you know, we're working with, the lowest income folks, but even people in middle income are finding it very challenging to find a rental that they can afford right now.
Thank you. We had a follow-up question to that in the chat box. Are you finding, and Amanda, if you don't mind responding to this one, are you finding that lack of rental units available is more of the problem during the pandemic than the lack of the ability to pay?
I would definitely say that's the case from our standpoint. So one of the great things that's happened as a result of the pandemic is that there's a ton of attention and focus and money for housing, and that's coming down at every level of government. You see that funding coming forward federally, at the state level, and at the local level. So subsidy is less of an issue. Inventory is a huge issue, and Michelle, touched on that, but we've really seen that in-migration has been a challenge, has created a challenge as a result of the pandemic, where folks are migrating from other states, maybe with higher levels of COVID infection, to Maine, to be in a more rural, less populated area, taking up some of those rental units that might otherwise typically be available for the folks who are already living and working here. And I think that, in combination with a reduction in turnover of units as a result of the eviction moratorium, has really created a crisis of inventory, in that we just don't have the inventory available, which then in turn has created the supply and demand issue, resulting in exponentially increased rental amounts. So where historically we might have seen in Augusta a 2-bedroom unit be rented for $900 a month, we're now seeing, $1,400 or $1,600 a month for a 2-bedroom unit is kind of a common price point that we're seeing now. To complicate that, from the standpoint of the voucher program, and I know Mike mentioned, it's difficult for folks to find housing where they can use their voucher. So HUD, the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, which funds the Section 8 voucher program, sets a fair market rent annually. And so for the 2022 fair market rents that were just published, they're utilizing data from the American Community Survey in 2019. So the data that they're utilizing is a couple of years old. And while they do look at, they do survey rents for folks that have moved, and they do apply an inflation factor, there still seems to be a lag in terms of what the fair market rent is as published by HUD versus what we are actually seeing in the market. And so that creates a challenge in terms of what the voucher program can pay and approve for a rental unit in the community. And typically what we're seeing now is that the amount that we can pay as a housing authority is significantly less than what's available in the market. A lot of the vouchers are being returned unused, even with maximum extensions, because folks just are not able to find a place to rent.
Thank you, Amanda. We have some other questions that have been rolling in, and we're gonna thank you so much for that. It's great to see people so engaged and anxious to pose those questions, but we're gonna save a few to the end just to get through some of the questions that we had generated. So moving on to the next one, I think we've been talking about this and, you know, in the conversations we've already been having, but Mike, what would you say are the biggest issues with this housing supply in this region?
Yeah, I think a lot of the issues have already been touched upon. It's the affordability factor. Rents have gone up significantly and they've outstripped the FMRs that HUD puts out. And housing authorities do have some latitude in that, but you know, even if we go to 110% payment standard, it's still not sufficient to pay the rents that as they are out there right now. That's a big issue. Another issue is if you have a subsidized unit, you have to have it inspected. It has to meet housing quality standards. And the fact is that Maine has the oldest housing stock in the country. So a lot of the units, many of the units out there, I'll say, won't necessarily pass an inspection or will need significant repair to pass an inspection. And that's generally not a burden that a landlord is going to bear when they can turn around and rent it on the free market for, you know, the same price or more, and not have to worry about getting an inspection or signing a HAP, which is a housing assistance agreement. So they just find it simpler to go with fair market and not deal with subsidies at all. And that creates a significant squeeze on the lowest income, which are relying on these subsidies to become housed. The other issue is and it was a question that was referred to in the chat. We don't have enough, we're not building a sufficient number of affordable units in Maine. And that comes down to right now, construction costs are sky high and getting contractors to work on projects is very difficult. They're extremely busy. We are in a building boom right now. So it comes down to a crunch of the existing stock is old in a large part and is hard to get up to standards, can also be rented for above a fair market rent value or the voucher payment standard, I should say. Which makes it unavailable for people who are using a subsidy. And then new housing stock is hard to get shovels in ground right now because it's hard to get contractors and it's hard to get materials at an affordable price. So it just creates a conundrum.
And if I could piggyback on that, because we do have a real estate development division as well here at KDCAP. We're currently working on 2 projects in Somerset County. But those kinds of projects, they are very time intensive. They're very complex to put together the funding that it takes to get a project off the ground. So from, you know, the idea stage to the time of actually putting people in a building, you know, you're looking, you know, minimum 2 years, probably closer to 3 years. So it's not a quick fix for sure.
Can I add a couple things?
Sure.
So just to expand on that a little bit, absolutely affordability is key. I think also just that there's an inadequate supply of appropriate housing. And by that, I mean, you know, housing that matches an individual's and families' specific needs. That could be, you know, permanent supportive housing. It could be transitional housing, particularly housing that is, I think someone mentioned it already, that is clean and safe and actually, you know, appropriate for a human inhabiting it. It could be sober housing. It could be apartments that are large enough to accommodate large families. So I think it's absolutely affordability, but it's also just appropriate housing in general.
I could just add to that too. Caitlin, I don't know how many questions you're going to get through with this panel.
Not a problem.
So I would echo what Michelle said in terms of the turnaround time. So we develop affordable housing here at Augusta Housing too, and it is like 2 to 3 years, sometimes longer, to bring a project from concept to fruition. And what we have seen is that in the time that we're able to bring a building to completion, our community has lost an equal number of units due to fire, code violations, they're coming offline for some reason. And so we're barely treading water here in terms of maintaining the number of affordable units, and knowing that in Augusta, we have a need for hundreds more units of affordable rental housing. So that is certainly a challenge. We had recently commissioned Jeff Levine, who is a professor at MIT and formerly worked for the city of Portland, to complete a housing study for us. And the results of that study were really interesting. And one of the things that he found is exactly what Sarah was talking about, in that the inventory that we have in Augusta in terms of unit sizes and support services available don't necessarily tie into the population living here. And so in Augusta, there is a huge need for 1-bedroom apartments. And there's a smaller need for some really large units, primarily due to our new Mainer population. And that doesn't match the unit sizes that we have here in the community. So that was interesting. But the other issue is, we're a community, we're a service community. We are here in the shadow of Riverview Psychiatric Hospital. We have a population living in our community that many of whom need supportive services in order to be successful in housing. And it really feels like that is a missing piece that, from a high systems level, just really needs to be addressed in some way.
Thank you, Amanda. I just want to follow up. You had mentioned some issues that arise with new Mainers and the families and their needs that they have. Are there any other specific issues that new Mainers face when trying to access housing?
Well, the number one issue that we see is finding a unit large enough to accommodate a family. And so we've worked with families with 12 family members. And in the particular family I'm thinking of, they were living in a 2-bedroom apartment because that's all that they could find. And, we just don't have the housing stock here in Augusta with 4 or 5-bedroom apartment rentals. And so then these large families are really, their only option would be to rent a single family home. And of course, that's incredibly challenging given the market and inventory available. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is discrimination is a real issue for these families. And I've heard some really unfortunate stories about that being a barrier for folks finding safe, affordable housing in our community.
And I'll jump in and expand on that. Another couple other barriers that new Mainers are facing are simply because of their citizenship status and their immigration status. They're not eligible for every subsidy. They're not eligible for every resource that is out there because there are restrictions put on some of these. So they're not necessarily eligible for everything that's out there, which means that their options are limited. The other thing is, and this gets into a deeper conversation, is there are tools, assessment tools that agencies use. And I'll give the example, Maine Housing has had our supported shelters using a tool called the VISPID app, which I'm going to try to spell out the acronym, which is rarely ever said. It's the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool. But that's a mouthful, so we call it the VISPID app. It's a tool that's been used nationwide. It's actually been used in multiple countries. It's the most common assessment tool for people who are homeless to determine where they should be housed. And it's scored from 0 to 20. There's a version for individuals, there's a version for adults, there's a version for youth. It's a very well-developed tool that's in very common use. Earlier this year, the organization that has developed it and supported it has said that they are withdrawing it from use at the end of this year because the back-end data has shown that there's significant racial inequity in the use of this tool. When you look at the housing results from people who are white and non-white using this tool, there is a significant disparity in successful housing outcome. So recognizing that the tool, they made some adjustments to it, the data didn't improve. So recognizing that there are serious flaws with this tool, they've decided to withdraw it from use. But it just illustrates that there is a systemic issue that's causing barriers to new Mainers and other people of color to getting housed that don't show up in first blush. And it makes it a very complex and thorny issue.
Thank you, Mike. I think unless anyone has anything to add to that question, I think we're going to move on to what our local organizations or your organization specifically, what are you doing to combat the housing crisis? Michelle, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, sure. So we, of course, we touched on a few things so far. The emergency rental assistance program has been a huge influx of funding available to people throughout Maine, and it's being operated through all of the CAPs in Maine, and it's had many iterations. So in the first iteration, it was sort of a small amount of money, but very low barrier to accessing the money. And over time, the use of the funds has grown. So now we can help people not only with rent going all the way back to March 13th, 2020. The funds can help an eligible tenant for up to 18 months. And we can also help with some utilities such as electricity, water, heat, internet, those kinds of things. But as the amount of funding and the amount of uses has grown, so also has the eligibility criteria. So there's now more documentation that people have to provide in order to be eligible for the funding. So that again comes with some of its own challenges. In addition to the emergency rental assistance piece that we're doing, helping people to pay for their housing, we also have a housing stability component now that started the last couple of months, also funded through Maine Housing, whereby we can provide some additional assistance to folks who are having some challenges with their housing and their housing situation is considered to be unstable. So we can work with folks and help connect them to other resources. There are some key partners that are also funded through these funds through Maine Housing, including Pine Tree Legal, which is providing some legal assistance for folks who are actually being evicted. We also can tap some mediation services for folks if maybe the situation could be remediated through some discussion between the landlord and the tenant. We also have Prosperity Maine is providing some cultural services and interpreter services when working with those new Mainer populations. And then we also are referring folks in-house at KVCAP to our Resource Navigator program if folks have needs beyond those few that I just mentioned. Some of the other things that we're doing, as I talked about, was the real estate development. We are actively looking at in conversations with various communities, various groups, looking at potential viable projects to build affordable housing in communities. That's ongoing, but as Amanda also alluded to, those, those are long-term sort of projects and solutions. And then I don't know if you wanted me to talk about the Affordable Housing Task Force right now, or do you want me to talk about that later?
I think we'll get to that in a little bit.
Okay.
Thank you, Michelle.
Okay.
Sarah, do you want to touch upon some of the services and things that you're doing at your organization?
Sure. So what we do, and also first I want to also just give a shout out to all the case managers out there, because I think case management right now is a really hard job. And those are folks who are working one-on-one with individuals, probably a lot right now with housing and homelessness. So that's how people get connected to KVCAP and Maine Housing and places like Bridging the Gap. So so some of what we do and also other organizations do is more indirectly. So we assist with sort of offsetting the cost of housing by supporting folks with food, clothing, hygiene products, things like that. That's an indirect way. And then there's also a informal network of organizations that have helping funds. And so for folks who are not eligible or do not have access to the more formal routes of financial support for rent, we get a lot of those calls too. And so we go through a process of seeing whether or not we are able to collectively support someone with a security deposit or supporting them with rent. So a lot of boots on the ground sort of stuff.
Great, thank you. Amanda, do you want to talk a little bit about what's going on with your company as well?
Sure. So our focus right now, obviously we have the voucher program, and seeing that the largest challenge facing our community in terms of housing people really is a lack of safe, affordable inventory. So we're really focusing on developing new affordable housing units. And so we currently have 3 potential sites in some phase of pre-development. One at the Hodgkin School site. There's a field behind the site or adjacent to the site that we are looking at. The city just gave us an option on a city-owned parcel located on Park Street, which is behind Bangor Street. The Hodgkin site, we estimate being able to develop 36 units of senior housing there. The Park Street site, we estimate being able to develop 24 units there. Population is yet to be determined. And then in our office building here on Union Street in Augusta, which is next to the YMCA, we currently share this building with the Augusta Police Department. And as many of you probably know, the police department will be moving to a new location with a new building over on Willow Street in Augusta. And so we have put an offer into the city to purchase this building with the hopes that we would be able to do some type of adaptive reuse project, putting housing units in the building, as well as retaining our office space here as well. So those 3 projects combined get us to just under 100 units of new affordable housing. Of course, the challenge is the timeline, because again, it takes a very long time to bring these projects to fruition. So I would say ambitiously, we would be looking at maybe 5 years to complete all 3 projects. And again, those would all be subject to city and planning board approvals as well. So certainly not at a place where we can confidently say they would be moving forward, but that's what we're focusing on. One of the reasons we're so heavily focused on developing new units outside of just the fact that we need more affordable quality units in our community is the problem where we're seeing a reduction in the number of private landlords willing to participate in our Section 8 voucher program. And so the more affordable units that we can develop and own, the more opportunities we create to project base some of our vouchers into the buildings that we're constructing, and also provide opportunities for folks with just a regular voucher to lease a really nice newly constructed unit in our community. So those are the primary things that we're working on at this moment.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Mike, is there anything you'd like to add about what your organization is doing?
Absolutely. So Maine Housing is doing a number of things across a number of different programs. So Maine Housing, primarily, we are a funding agency. So we're not necessarily boots on the ground. That would be like the CAPS and some of the other agencies who actually are doing the work with the client. But we're funding a number of programs that are helping people in various stages of housing and homelessness for during the pandemic and looking past the pandemic. So we received some federal money for emergency solutions grant, specifically for COVID response. We put some of that out to our shelters to help alleviate some of the excess costs that are coming with the pandemic. That includes additional PPE, personal protective equipment, reconfiguring their shelters to make them socially distant, and then also paying for hotel rooms to supplement because their census count has dropped because they don't have the space anymore. So we provided the shelters with those grants so that they can adapt and respond to the pandemic. We've also partnered with FEMA to set up a number of hotels across the state to also bolster the shelter capacity. And it's a similar program, it's just a different funding stream. We've also established what's called a diversion program. So nationally, we've realized that the number one predictor of any bout of homelessness is previous stints of homelessness. So if we can keep people from falling into homelessness, then we can prevent future bouts of homelessness. So we've established, at least for the time being, while we have COVID funds, we've established a diversion program. And what that is when people are about to become homeless, they know that they're imminently homeless. They're about to be kicked out by their aunt, their uncle, their parents, or they're about to be evicted or thrown out. They can give one of the participating shelters a call, and they can work with them. Everybody who's doing this program has gone through what's called rapid resolution training. And sometimes it doesn't require funding. Sometimes it's having a conversation, with mom and with the person to say, what's going on? How can we help you get through this? And sometimes it is, helping with the security deposit, helping with arrearages and rent. And we have funding available for that. We're using funding through ERA. We're also using funding through the emergency solution grant money. We're also encouraging the individual programs, although we can't provide the funding. We don't have a funding source because the funding we're providing is federally mandated to have certain requirements. So there's only certain things it can be used for. We're also encouraging our constituent programs to look for flexible sources of funding that they could use for other things that aren't necessarily covered with the funding we're giving. So things like, Hannaford gift cards, because, your friend says you can't keep eating here because you have we have food stamps and you're eating through our food. Well, here, have some Hannaford gift cards so that you can provide food to the household. Sometimes it's simple as that to keep someone housed and keep them from falling into homelessness. So that's something we've been doing. We've been putting these programs on the ground throughout the pandemic. We're looking forward also to a HUD notice coming out, hopefully within the next month or so, because part of the American Rescue Plan was some funding through the Fed Home program. And that's going to be used to create some permanent supported housing, some transitional housing. It's about $16 million of money that I think we're bolstering with about $3 million additional dollars. So we'll end up close to $20 million that we're going to use to fund some permanent supported housing. And what we're looking for primarily to develop this, once we have the specific guidance from HUD, we're going to be looking for things that aren't going to take 2-3 years. We at Maine Housing know full well it takes a long time. We do a lot of development. We're going to be looking for proposals that could happen quickly. We're looking at California and Vermont, who have successfully sponsored programs to purchase hotels and convert them into supported housing units, whether they be SROs, which are single room occupancy units, or efficiencies. And finding a suite hotel you can convert to efficiencies. Finding things that are going to have a minimal amount of time for turnaround and a minimal amount of investment per unit, so that we can get more units on the ground quicker.
Great, thank you, Mike. Michelle, you spoke a little bit about this before, that there's a regional affordable housing task force that the United Way of Kennebec Valley started, and KB CAP is going to be leading in the future. Can you tell us a little bit about that group's work?
Sure. And so I would definitely like to give a shout out to Courtney, because it was really due to her coordination and sort of passion to do something about the situation. She and Eric Lind, who's a council member in Augusta, really pulled together this task force because there was this fear that I think we're starting to see come to fruition, that through the pandemic and with the eviction moratoriums and rental housing assistance, that was all well and good, but there was going to come a time when all of that is going to come to an end, and then what? So this group got together, and many of the people who are on today are on the task force, including Amanda and Sarah. So please, I invite you also to jump in and give your 2 cents along the way. But this group of folks came together, and I think it's fair to say that we all came together because we're concerned about the situation. We have passion around trying to come up with solutions. I would say that one of the first and greatest outcomes so far has just been having a forum for all these people to come together. I think some new partnerships and some new relationships have developed because of the task force. In addition to that, there were 3 subcommittees that were put together. One subcommittee really focused on how you deal with working with someone who is homeless in the moment. And some of the folks who were on the task force would run into this and not really even know, like, where do I go? What do I do? Especially if it's, let's say, if it's a Friday afternoon and the shelter is full. So one of the things that group did was they put together a very useful tool that sort of walks through the steps of where the first call might be, where the second call might be. How do you troubleshoot that particular situation in the moment? And so that has been shared with all of the agencies who are who could come into contact with somebody who's homeless, and it's been a really great, valuable tool. Then there's another subcommittee that has been working more on trying to prevent homelessness from happening in the first place. One thing that has come out of that group is this idea of when people are, or say they're coming out of homelessness and they're moving into an apartment, a lot of times they don't have all of the tools that you need to be successful as a renter. They start off with nothing. They don't have cleaning supplies, laundry baskets. So they put together some kits that we're able to distribute to folks who are in that situation. And I don't know, is there anybody who's on that group who's been involved more in that second group that has anything else to add? And then the third group is really looking more at sort of long-term systemic issues, including barriers that people currently encounter when trying to find affordable rent, and also the development of affordable housing. So those are sort of the 3 areas. Courtney, do you have anything to add?
Thank you, Michelle. I would just say this has been quite the journey as an organization to be part of this. And like Michelle said, I think we saw a housing cliff coming, and it's been prolonged. Like it hasn't happened quite yet, but we're right at that cliff. I mean, Michelle, even what you said at the beginning of this call, these last 3 weeks have been like nothing KVCAP has ever seen before. We're entering a really dangerous time, and it's really great to have those 35 or so people meeting regularly to talk about it. And I just want to thank KVCAP for taking this on as more of a direct service organization and leading this effort moving forward. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Courtney, for jumping in on that. I appreciate it. Sarah, a question for you. You've played a big role in developing some of the regional housing guides out of that work group. What do those look like, and how can we access them?
Sure. So actually, Michelle did a great job of explaining what those are. So I actually won't spend a whole lot of time other than to say that they were really actually developed for those who are providing services and not so much for the individual seeking services. One of them was an emergency response guide that was also made available. And I'll also say that it's fairly Augusta specific, not to say that other communities could not develop their own. So this one was also shared with the Downtown Alliance with the idea that business owners might find it helpful if they ever come into contact with someone who is homeless and seeking assistance. And then there was a second one, which is far more nuanced and involved. And that really looks at what a service provider or a church secretary or a case manager might need to look at in working with someone who is on the verge of being homeless, more of a long-term, not an immediate solution type thing. And so we worked on kind of doing the steps for that, and that is also meant for service providers. That is not to say that if anyone would like access to that, feel free to contact me. The reason why it's not being put out just to the general public is that there's a couple of numbers in there that are after hours numbers that are, that need to be protected, I guess is the best way to say it. But it was really an amazing exercise in working with the team to put together these, because it just provided like a very real example of what it looks like and what it takes in our particular community to support these folks. I will stop there on that question.
Thank you, Sarah. Amanda, is there anything you'd like to add? Anything about the housing task force?
Just that I think it's been really helpful for all of the folks working in housing to connect, because one of the challenges that I'm seeing is that there's so much attention on housing, there's funding coming from all directions, and we're all trying to come up with ways to fight the battle. And we're going to be most effective if we pull together and work together in a cohesive way. So that's been really great. We have had an opportunity through that task force to connect with Will Harper at KVCOG, who's working on the Working Communities Challenge grant on housing issues as well, and to become a part of that working group. And I don't think that would have happened if not for the work of the Affordable Housing Task Force. So I would just give more kudos to Courtney. It's much appreciated that she took the initiative to pull this group together. And I think that we'll see long-lasting change in our community as a result of her efforts.
Thank you. Mike, this question is for you. What is Maine Housing's role in helping people find housing at a local level?
So that's actually, I was going to jump back to the previous question, but this is actually a great segue because it's going to touch on both. So the Housing Tech Task Force around Augusta is a great example of different agencies collaborating together and creating a response that's greater than the sum of its parts. Maine Housing and the Statewide Homeless Council have actually been working together over the last year and a half to design a system which we call service hubs, which will actually create such a collaborative environment and collaborative task forces throughout the state. So there'll be there will be 9 hubs overall initially, and that's going to be a flexible system which may change if we realize that hubs need to be divided or need to be combined. But the idea is to have that collaboration and to have that not centralized, but have that single point of contact, single collaborative space where not only providers can rely on each other for resources, but also people in need of help will know where to go so that they can go to a single point of contact and then be directed where they need to go. So that is one of the things that we are working on. To get to the question you had asked, we are working on establishing these hubs so that it makes the system less complex for the end user. That's a big thing that everybody who has gone through homelessness and contacted the homeless response system has expressed, is that it's a very complex system, and if you don't have help going through it, it can be very difficult. So we're looking to create a simplified system for the end user. It's going to be a little more work on the back end. It's more meetings for people who already have a lot of meetings for the service providers, but it's to make it easier for the end user so that they know they can go to a hub coordinator and say, they can call 211 and say, I'm here, I need help. And they will say, you're going to talk to such and such in Augusta. They're the Kennebec hub coordinator, and they will get you in contact with the services you need. And then they'll be guided through that process. The other thing we're doing right in the moment to help get people housed is we also, and it's something I didn't mention before, is we have emergency housing vouchers that HUD has issued. And these are vouchers that Maine Housing has a certain number of them, and then other local PHAs have some throughout the state. And these are, the benefits to these are that they have an additional landlord incentive that can go along with it, so that if you have a reluctant landlord that isn't willing to take a subsidy or needs some convincing, we can add a financial incentive to it to get them across the finish line to accept a subsidy. It's also can pay up to 120% of the normal voucher payment standard, which when we were talking before about that, you know, our rents have outstripped the payment. This is to help bridge that gap as well. So it will capture some of those units that are just beyond the reach of the voucher right now and allow them to actually be utilized. And these vouchers are specifically for people who are homeless right now. So if there is someone who is literally homeless, is out on the street, is living in a shelter, is living in one of the hotels that are supported by you know, federally or state funded program, we can work with them to get them one of these vouchers and try to get them housed.
Thanks, Mike. Amanda, can you tell us a little bit about the exciting Boston Fed grant that some of you are working on with KV Council of Governments and what you're doing with the initial funding?
Sure. So I talked about this, I touched on this earlier, but through the work of the Affordable Housing Task Force, we became connected with Will Harper at KV Cog, who is spearheading the grant, which is through Boston Fed. It's a Working Communities Challenge grant. The grant has 2 phases. One is a design phase with grant awards of $25,000. And the second phase is an implementation phase with grant awards of $375,000. So the group includes KV Cog as kind of like the spearheading applicant, but includes partner agencies such as Augusta Housing, City of Gardner. I'm going to leave off important people here, but we have, it's fairly duplicative of the folks participating in the Housing Task Force, the United Way, and so on. And so Michelle and I are just in every meeting together lately, KV Cap. So all of the partner agencies are working together now on the design phase. And so we were successful in being awarded $25,000. And the point of the design phase is to work together as a team to determine on a specific issue, which we have identified as housing. And our work together is focused on creating an application for the implementation phase of the grant, for the larger grant, so that we can actually do some real work. And so the portion that we're in now is really focused on, more than anything else, probably data gathering in order to inform our future work in the implementation.
I think we might.
By data and oh,
You cut
am I
out for
breaking
just
up?
a minute there, Amanda, but
Oh no,
no.
I'm sorry
Oh,
about
that's
that. Okay, so anyway, so did everyone hear about the design phase that we're working on data gathering? Okay, and hopefully the data that we gather through this phase, which will be done through the creation of a temporary housing navigator position, which will be housed within Augusta Housing, and hopefully we'll have that person here for 16 weeks. The housing navigator will be working with families who are probably the same families calling Michelle's office, who are homeless, at risk of becoming homeless, or having a challenge with regards to housing stability. And the navigator position will work closely with families to help them find all of the resources that they need to search for housing and be stable in their housing if they have that. And housing navigators have been used successfully across the state for a long time. Our navigator position is a little different in that we're not just focused on the homeless population. We're focused on housing search and stability for anyone who needs that help, so that we can better understand who is needing help in our community and what are the barriers and gaps in resources in the Kennebec region. And that data in terms of barriers and gaps will help inform where we want to focus our work in the implementation phase. Another thing that we're doing as part of the design phase is hosting a couple of listening sessions where hopefully we'll be able to hear from folks with lived experience, recent lived experience in housing challenges, whether it's homelessness or, housing instability of any sort. We want to hear from those folks. So that will be part of our work. And we're just really, as we work through this design phase, starting to really think about what types of work we can do with the larger grant in the implementation phase. And the cool thing about this grant, as opposed to other grants that we've seen come down the pike, is that this one is really focused on systems level change. So it's really high level. They don't want to see you just develop another program and throw money at it. What can you create that will change it up to create long-term success? So it's nice to see an organization investing money in the community in a way that will address systems change, and we're excited to be a part of that. I don't know if Michelle or Courtney, if you have anything else to add.
No, I think you did a really good job summarizing it, Amanda.
Thank you, Amanda. We have one last question before we get to some of the questions that have come up in the chat and open it up to any final questions. This question is going to be for you, Michelle. What is being done to facilitate transition from affordable housing to home ownership?
From specifically affordable housing to home ownership, or to home ownership in general?
I believe to home ownership in general.
Okay, sure. So we do have homebuyer education classes that have been ongoing even through the pandemic. We've converted those to online. And in addition to that, we have a housing counselor position that will work with folks on pre-purchase counseling, post-purchase counseling. I will say that during this pandemic year, that work slowed immensely for, a few reasons. I think partly we were really immersed in the emergency rental situation. We also have found that people have not been as what's the word? They haven't been looking maybe to make a big change. People sort of hunkered down, I think, where they were. So we didn't do a lot of that work in this past year. We also had some turnover in the position, and it is challenging to hire folks that have the credentials or that want to come in and gain the credentials. So we do have a housing counselor on board now. I think that one of the other things that we're going to be looking at in-house is we've been through all of this work with the Housing Task Force, with the Working Communities Challenge, we've started some discussions around other ways to think about helping folks move from renting to becoming homeowners. And in fact, I was just on a call prior to this meeting where we heard from someone from the Genesis Fund talking about projects where you bring folks in as or maybe you even rehab a unit full of folks who are renting but who would like to become owners of their own unit and convert those units into condos that they are able to purchase. So it's a really cool idea. I don't know a lot about it, but it's definitely something that I will be bringing back to our real estate development director as something to look into, so that there are different avenues for folks who maybe never would have thought of becoming a homeowner, but this would be potentially a viable option for them, something that they would be interested in pursuing and would be within reach of folks to do that.
Thank you, Michelle. So I believe we are going to jump into the questions that came through the chat for now. Michelle has been keeping track of those as we've been going, so I will turn it over to her to pose those questions.
Thanks, Caitlin. Okay, so a couple of questions have come through regarding vouchers. So any of the panelists want to touch on these, maybe specifically Mike or Amanda? We'll start with, will additional extensions be granted for people with vouchers due to the lack of availability of housing options in the Kennebec area?
Yes. So we provide extensions basically forever. Certainly for anyone with a disability, that makes it even more challenging for them to find housing. Yes, that is absolutely the case.
And that is the same for Maine Housing. We are granting extensions. We understand that finding a unit is extremely hard right now. So we're not pulling vouchers because the time is elapsing.
Thank you. And the other one about vouchers. What about people in poverty who have a home that is in need of repair so that the person can occupy it? In this case, the person has a mobile home that is uninhabitable due to mechanical problems, but the person has no money to do that. The person has vouchers, but those don't help with what they need or want to do.
So just a point of clarity, was that they are renting a mobile home or they own it?
Susan, do you want to provide some clarity on that? Oh, they own it.
Okay, so one thing that one program Maine Housing does have is we do have a mobile home replacement program. So if the mobile home is a mobile home and not a manufactured home, meaning it was manufactured before 1976, which is when HUD changed the title of that definition. So if it is a mobile home from pre-1976, we do have a program that could help with the cost of replacing that mobile home in its entirety.
For further information on that, should Susan or anyone else who's interested in that information reach out to you? Can I provide them with you?
Absolutely. I'll put my email in the chat.
Thank you. And then just talking about lack of units. So in my neighborhood alone, there are several large houses that are vacant and have been for a long time. However, they remain vacant and are deteriorating. Could Augusta Housing or Augusta City, not sure who this would be directed to, do something about these units that could be occupied, but those owners hang on to them?
So that's a complicated answer because privately owned homes owned by multiple different individuals, it's difficult. Sometimes folks are hanging on to property for a number of different reasons. One thing that I always suggest when I hear about vacant property, especially if it looks like it's not being maintained, is to call the city's code enforcement office and just let them know, because the city of Augusta does have an ordinance specific to maintenance as well as vacant properties. And sometimes a push from the city around those ordinances can trigger a property owner to think about whether or not they might be in a place where they want to sell the property. Another thing to think about is small scale development. So this is something that's been really interesting to me for a long time, is looking at how to get just regular community members involved in small scale development. And so many people who live in our community have the capacity to purchase a building, renovate it, and maybe sell it or rent it. And there's a woman out in Buffalo, New York. Her name is Bernice Radle, and it's RADLE. And she owns a company called Buffalo Development. And she started out as just kind of like a regular person without development experience who was passionate about creating long-term change in the community that she lived in Buffalo, and creating better rental housing and redeveloping parts of the community. And she just started taking on small multifamily buildings or single family homes and one by one redeveloping them herself. She comes to Maine typically at least once a year to provide talks on that. She's certainly worth listening to, but I don't think it's beyond a lot of us here today to take on some of this work ourselves. And when I think about single family homes, I think about that as a way where a lot of us could get involved on an individual level and make a difference in the community.
I'll just follow up that question because there was one in the chat box, very long. Thank you, Dawn. At the end, she's asking about buying options being complicated with astronomically high prices in the current selling market. So how can we help, given just what you said about buying up rental properties and fixing them up if the current selling market, I guess, is prohibiting that for a lot of people?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a challenge as well as construction costs. And I think one of the challenges we're seeing in terms of buyers is that we're seeing a lot of cash buyers in Maine now, folks coming in from out of state or even folks in state who are, you'll see bidding wars and someone comes in with cash and they're 50 grand over asking, with a cash offer that's tough to beat. So I think we're seeing the market start to shift a little bit in a direction that might be leaning towards things coming back to a place where folks might be in a better position to buy. It is a challenging time now to purchase things. So
I'll jump in on that. From personal experience, I closed on a house yesterday. And I can say that through this process, the market is starting to cool down very, very slightly. We'll see if that continues on a cooling trend or whether or not it stabilizes here. But it is starting to cool down. You're seeing sellers price and then starting to drop prices because they're not getting what they initially are asking for, which was not happening 6 months ago. You could put any number on a property as long as it was within the same zip code as the right price, it would go. And it would go for well over asking. So we are seeing some cooling down. So if there are people who want to purchase rental properties and they want to make them affordable for people, but they need repair. Maine Housing does have a landlord repair program. So if you are intending to rent at an affordable rate and you are intending to take subsidies, you can contact Maine Housing and we can see about what your repair needs are and whether or not we can help you with the costs of those. So once you have the unit, we can help get it to the point where it will pass a housing quality standards inspection.
And then to the entire panel, if people can't buy rental properties, what can community members as individuals do to help with this issue?
So I'll jump in again. So one thing that I had mentioned earlier in our discussion was a diversion program, where there are programs out there that try to catch people as they're about to become homeless and prevent them from becoming homeless in the first place. Because like I said, the number one predictor for future bouts of homelessness is past bouts. Once you become homeless once, it's much easier to fall in again. And it's much easier to stay homeless. So if we can catch the most amount of people before they become homeless and try to keep as many from becoming homeless, it prevents the crisis from growing, and it shrinks the number of people who need the help in the homeless response system. And one of the things that I mentioned is that a lot of the funding that we're providing as Maine Housing, it's state and it's federal funding, and it has state and federal strings attached to it. In reality, there needs to be flexible funding sources where it isn't, oh, it can only be used for X, Y, and Z, and you need to put this type of, have this type of record keeping, which you need to keep for 5 years, and it needs to be in this form of note. It's a lot of burden for these programs to do that, and they do a fantastic job of it. They also need flexible funding that they can use for whatever that client needs that's presenting to keep them from falling into homelessness. So if you can provide donations to shelters, to homeless service providers that can be used flexibly, because like I said, sometimes it just comes down to $100 Hannaford card or a $50 gas card so that they can get to work for the week. Sometimes that's all it takes. So it doesn't have to be tens of thousands of dollars. Although if it is, that's fantastic. But private philanthropy can bolster the federal and state governmental funds to make them more flexible and keep people from going into homelessness in the first place.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists want to add on to that?
I definitely can. So in terms of something that everyone can do in our community that would be really helpful would just to be a champion of affordable housing in our community. And that's something that we really desperately need. So often when I'm bringing a project to planning board, and I see this in all of the communities across the state, you have people who have sung the praises of of affordable housing development, but when it comes to a development that's close to them or maybe on a site that is meaningful to them in some way, then it's a NIMBY situation. And so if you live, whether you live in Augusta or any other community, if you see something happening in your community that would further opportunities for the people who work in your community, who are in your community, to live in your community affordably, just be a champion for that cause. Come out to a planning board meeting and speak in support of housing work, in support of development of new affordable units. That's a great way. It doesn't cost anything, and it's a great way to support advancing those opportunities for people here in Kennebec Valley.
Thanks, Amanda. You did mention NIMBYism. So there was a question in the chat about that. So how does NIMBYism fit into this? Habitat for Humanity is trying to build an affordable housing development in Rockland. And my understanding is that the development is facing a lot of opposition from neighbors. But I imagine that's true elsewhere in Maine.
Yeah, it's totally true. We So we had announced a proposal to develop senior units on the Hodgkins Field, which is adjacent to the historic Hodgkins School, which we converted maybe back in 2016 into 47 units of affordable senior housing. And so this is a proposal for basically a phase 2 of that project. Still senior housing, you know, really quiet neighbors. And we've seen such broad community support for the work that we're doing at Augusta Housing, and for you know, people recognize the need for affordable housing. But as soon as that proposed project was announced, I think Lindsay is not muted.
Oh, okay.
Lindsay, can you mute yourself, please? Lindsay Corbett. Thank you.
Okay. So as soon as we announced that project, there was just this rallying of people on social media in total outrage that we would be utilizing green space in the community to build housing. And so even reaching out to people individually, talking about how limited we are in Augusta, as in any other community in the state, in terms of sites that would score competitively for the low-income housing tax credit, which is really the only remaining development tool for affordable housing on a larger scale. Folks just, you know, when they feel passionate about something, it's hard to get through. So even though we have a number of other, many other parks and many other green spaces in the community, it's still an issue. And so we see that, you see that with every project. You see people come out in droves in opposition, you know, everything from, we don't want those people living next to us, to, you know, people worried about, with our Maple Street project, which was a family project, we had people concerned that children were going to be falling in the river. We had people express concerns that children would have to walk uphill to the bus stop. You know, lots of concerns. So, and those are always, I think those are always going to happen. But what would be really great is if we had a YIMBY movement, which is yes, in my backyard. And if we could get folks out to publicly support the work that is being done and say, you know, I'm okay with using this space in our community if it means that we can provide housing, affordable, quality, new housing that we desperately need. So it does have an impact in every community, and we need the YIMBYs out there too.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to touch on those?
Yeah, I think it's prevalent across the state, and not just for affordable housing, it's also for shelters. Portland, I'm sure you've read, and people have read in the Portland Press Herald and in BDN, there have been ongoing struggles with shelters in Portland. You know, there are multiple shelters on the peninsula in Portland, and the city is going to move their shelters off the peninsula and further up into the northern part of the city, and the people in that part of the city have shown significant opposition. But the existing neighborhood, the Bayside neighborhood where the shelters are now, have also had significant opposition to the shelters remaining. There's actually, Preble Street is creating a new shelter in that area, and there's been significant opposition in that area as well. Fortunately, there is enough public will to have these projects go ahead, but there is a vocal minority who push back on these projects. And I think it speaks also to, especially in Portland, the gentrification of that area. You know, I can say from personal experience, going to the Bayside neighborhood 5 years ago and going there last week, it's a very different neighborhood than it was. And the people who have, and it goes back to the increase in real estate prices and the increase in rents. Well, the people who are paying those rents no longer want to have that in their proverbial backyard. So they are saying they don't want it there anymore. And then they're asking it to move somewhere else where people have established this routine of having a certain makeup of their community and don't like that being disrupted. So I think it does tie into some of the other conversations we're having about the increase in price in housing, both for rental and for ownership, where it goes hand in hand. The more you pay for your backyard, the less you want to have anything in it.
So I think we have reached the end of those questions. Do the panelists, any of you have any final remarks or anything that you'd like to add? I know we didn't get quite to all the questions we had originally planned. So if there's anything you would like to include now.
Sure, I'll start. Just first of all, thank you for spending some time with us. And I think, as you can see, this is such a complex subject, and you know, and I think it's going to take a lot of intentional collaboration. And if we all are able to hitch our respective horses to the same wagon and put some strength and wisdom into it, we could get to a solution. And it might be slow, it might be messy, and it definitely won't be perfect. But I think having more conversations like this, as Amanda said, you know, speak out, get involved in your local government, letters to the editor, be willing to have difficult conversations. All of that really, really matters. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Sarah.
Yes, and I would thank you also for being invited to be part of this panel today. And it has been great to see people come together and shine a light on this issue and try to come up with solutions. And just hearing you, Mike, today talk about the homeless hub idea that will be moving forward, I feel like that's kind of moving forward in a parallel or very much parallel to the affordable task force. So I'm hope that there's ways that connections can be made there, because I would assume that many of the same players who are going to be involved in creating those hubs are the same players who are already on the Affordable Housing Task Force.
Yes, keep an eye on your email. Thank you, everybody from me and from Maine Housing for allowing us to participate in this as well. I would like to say that those of you who are not in the housing field, this isn't what you do every day. You might, you know, leave this and say, okay, well, that's one thing to think about. I'd just like to impress that housing is a fundamental thing that everybody needs, and everybody, without it, they struggle to function. And it will, if we have a housing crisis, we have a crisis in all different aspects of our society. We're facing a labor shortage right now, and part of that is if people can't afford to live places, they can't work there. So it just, once we have a housing crisis, it does touch on all different aspects of our society. So we need to address the crisis of housing so that we can address everything else. So thank you all for attending and listening to us.
And I would just echo what everyone else has said, and thank you for inviting me today. I don't think I could add anything further than what Mike, Michelle, and Sarah have concluded our session with today, but it's been really great. It's always great to hear from these other panelists and to see so many folks interested in the issue of affordable housing. Certainly, I would just offer that if anyone ever wants to connect with me with a question or an idea about affordable housing, I'm always available, and I'll go ahead and share my email address in the chat.
Great. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for being here today and sharing all of that information on such an important issue. We really appreciate your time, and thank you everyone who joined us today. If you have any further questions or information, Michelle will be sending out a follow-up email with contact information, and we'll have a way to reach back out to her. So thank you again, everyone.